last time when I was here, we finished with AppChain, and we will continue with AppChain. The panel's name is Shaping Tomorrow's AppChain. So please give a warm welcome to panel's moderator, CTO of Rockaway X Labs, Martin Weimelka.
Hello, good afternoon again. So welcome to the panel on Shaping Tomorrow's App Chains. I've got with me Barry, or as he's more well-known, Shaolin Flo from Dimension. Then there's Callum Waters from Celestia. And then there's Avril Dutail from Neutron. Welcome, guys. Excited to have you here. The choices for security models of app chains, all manner, blockchain constructions are exploding through the roof. So I think it's a good time to have a panel and discuss sort of these options. And I've got with me here either users and also builders of various of these propositions. So since the space is pretty complex, why don't we start with you guys sort of explaining what are you building on? What is your business in this sphere? Love to start with Avril.
Yeah, for sure. So we built a blockchain called Neutron, which is a cross-chain. It's a very secure cross-chain smart contracting platform, and the first consumer chain, e.g., instead of having its own sort of like fully in-house proof-of-stake mechanism, it essentially leverages the validator set and the stake of the Cosmos hub and gets its security from there over IBC. Yeah, I guess in just a few words, that's Neutron.
Thank you. Callum?
Celestia is focusing solely on the sort of data availability problem, so it just focuses on that, and that's where the sort of modularity comes in. We can talk more about that data availability problem later, but I guess that's the sort of the quick point.
Barry?
And Dimension focuses on the settlement aspect for modular blockchains. So these modular blockchains are SDK rollups, and they bridge through the Dimension hub, and they post data to a data availability layer like Celestia.
Perfect. So we've got different plays here. So I'd like to start with a question for Avril. You guys are the first ICS chain that came online. Congrats, by the way, producing blocks, validating, perfect. And what made you guys go for this choice, right? I mean, starting out, you had the choice just like everybody else. You could build your own app chain with this, with a validator set, but you went for this, which requires perhaps governance process, right? It has to be approved by the hub. And there are some trade-offs for this process. So can you take us through your thinking in this and what you're expecting from being a consumer chain?
Yeah, for sure. I think what's useful in this regard is to start, go back in time a little bit and sort of talk about what brought us to building Neutron in the first place, which is that we had built, our team had contributed to a pretty successful protocol, Lido on Terra, back in the days when Terra was still a thing. And that protocol was very successful locally, but while Terra was a Cosmos chain, actually, doing things with the rest of Cosmos from Terra was really difficult. And so, we had this research question of how do you actually scale a DeFi protocol across Cosmos and make it available across chains, right? And what we realized is that there were three sort of major pain points: the lack of security of a lot of platforms, the lack of cross-chain infrastructure to scale your protocol, and the sort of poor alignment. For example, Terra was pretty tribal, I guess you could say, and so it seemed like not the best place to sort of make that sort of cross-chain application. And so we wanted to solve these three problems. And replicated security essentially allowed us to eliminate two of them in one go, and to focus on, to eliminate security and lack of alignment with this one technology, and then to basically have the rest of our time and bandwidth to focus on building the cross-chain infrastructure that we needed to scale this protocol, right? And so the way it does this is that, one, you get very high economic security out of the box. Neutron on block 1 was one of the top 10 most secure blockchains by economic security, thanks to the hub, which has $2.5 billion of stake or something. And it also gets close ecosystem alignment through the Cosmos hub, which is sort of the central blockchain in the ecosystem that a lot of people are involved into. And so sort of becoming part of that ecosystem essentially was a good way to sort of create that broader alignment that would allow people to comfortably interact with cross-chain protocols deployed on Neutron.
Was it difficult to get into there as the first consumer chain? Like, what would you advise, other builders who are considering this move? What are the things they need to take into account?
Yeah, I mean, it's a new technology, right? So every time you're launching a new system, obviously there's going to be like optimizations to do, right? So launching the first one is obviously probably the most difficult. There's a lot of processes that were sort of like created and then tested for the purpose of launching Neutron, but basically, that allowed us to participate in creating all of the templates, the processes that basically will help other consumer chains in the future launch. We removed a bunch of issues and bugs that were found in the system over time. So launching the first one is definitely not easy, but I think as the technology matures, it's going to get more and more automated and more straightforward as more actors also know how to sort of like contribute, right? But in terms of Neutron, it's not really like our team launched it, right? It's a collaboration of like almost 200 teams, right? All of the validators on the Cosmos Hub, the core teams that built replicated security, IFA, our team, and others, right?
Right, yeah. Sounds like quite a process. So I want to talk with Barry a little bit about Dimension here. So can you, like you already said, you're focusing on settlement, but there's a bunch of services that you're sort of offering. And when I look at the tech that you guys are building, it feels to me a lot like a sort of like a batteries included approach. Like bring your roll up and we'll give you all these things that go with it. Can you describe like what are these value propositions that you guys are providing?
Yeah, so you have a roll up, and that is an SDK application. And it's connected immediately with IBC through a Dimension chain, which acts like a bridging hub to the IBC ecosystem. Then we are also eventually building an AMM, so you have liquidity and bridging. And this blockchain is more of like a validating blockchain, so it's like a validating bridge to these modular blockchains that kind of delegate consensus to the Dimension chain. And then you could bridge out to the whole ecosystem. So this kind of battery-packed approach is meaning that you have a rollup, you have like a single node or a few nodes, and you're automatically connected to the whole IBC ecosystem, no matter the security assumptions, because it's really the Dimension chain that's validating this bridge.
Right. That's pretty interesting. So I've looked over also the sort of development kit for the rollups. It seems really close to Cosmos SDK. Are you guys trying to sort of like be similar so it's easy to pick up for Cosmos engineers?
Yeah, so it's exactly like the Cosmos SDK. It's Cosmos SDK for rollups. It uses the ABCI interface, and we replaced Tendermint for Diamond. Diamond is a networking engine that publishes data in batches to a DA layer, and then the states and the state root to the settlement layer, which is the Dimension chain. By having the state, you can validate or invalidate the state header, and then the IBC bridge can actually function.
Right.
Can I ask a question on this as well? Yeah. Does Dimension also validate then the state of those rollups? Or how do the
it invalidates them. So like if they're optimistic rollups that have a dispute period,
yeah.
And if there's no dispute, then the bridge can go through.
Okay. And if there is a dispute, then the validators on the Dimension hub then have to walk through that like fraud proof,
exactly.
Right? Okay.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting question. Of course, leads us to Celestia. So, how are you guys thinking about your value proposition in the world, and what would you expect engineers? Why would you expect engineers to pick your particular solution?
So Celestia basically introduces a new set of like security models that you can add and allows you to build that. And that's essentially, I guess, the crux of solving the data availability problem. So beforehand, basically all sort of L1s use consensus. They require on everyone sort of executing the same thing. And I think when you sort of look at literature, what is the biggest bottleneck? It comes to execution. Like consensus is actually relatively fast and networking everything else. And so if we can actually like scale by having multiple different execution environments, but it's all using the same sort of consensus, then we can get better throughput. And so that was the crux of this. The data availability, we're looking at making sure that these individual roll-ups, the problem is that the block producers, they could kind of equivocate with what they produce. They could tell one group of people that this is the block and another group another. And so we're going to make sure that they commit to a single group, which then helps with sort of fraud proofs, with ZK proofs, and so forth.
In the spirit of looking at Dimension and thinking about, are there any benefits for rollups sort of building on top of Dimension and becoming becoming their own ecosystem? Are there any benefits to rollups that build on Celestia because they're using the same DA engine? Does that give them some additional properties or advantage?
It depends on what sort of like properties you want. Like if you want more customization, you can build directly on top of Celestia. What I expect to see is sort of in line with this modularity thesis, is a whole bunch of people, different people doing different components. So you'll have people providing sort of the out-of-the-box kit, like Dimension. You'll have people focusing on certain components, like sequences, shared sequences, like Astria are doing. And so I think we'll have actually a sort of, the ecosystem will be full of these like different options that you can sort of choose on. And it can be Celestia as the DA. There are other DAs out there as well. So there's definitely a lot of like different choices, and they all come with different trade-offs. So we're going to see a very vibrant sort of ecosystem, I think, of solutions.
And there's also kind of a partnership in a sense that each rollup on Dimension runs a light client of Celestia, which increases the block size eventually for the Celestia chain. So it kind of is a dynamic, more rollups, a bigger block size.
Bigger throughput, in some sense, yeah.
Yeah.
This is a good segue to another sort of set of ideas I want to talk about, which are trade-offs. Like you already said, the word trade-offs. So originally, the gold standard and the idea for making more Cosmos blockchains was everybody's going to have their own app chain. They'll have their own validator set. Now, as we know now, this is turning out to be A, expensive, and B, hard to manage. Everybody has to talk to their own validators, set things up, right? Validators are also overloaded. They are managing 20 networks. So there seem to be problems with scaling this out, right? So, but on the other hand, you have absolutely full control. You and your community have absolute control over the chain. Now, what I want to address here is what are the trade-offs I'm making? What I'm hearing from you guys is I'm getting extra services, I'm getting some scalability, guarantees or properties, and I'm getting some advantages. Now, my question would be, if I go and build like you did or on top of your platforms, is there something I'm giving up, right? So first, I'd like to ask Neutron, like, what do you see as the trade-offs? Like, you guys are now sort of dependent on an external validator set, and you also talked about incentive alignment. Are you guys at all thinking about like maybe the alignment sort of disappearing, or somehow being compromised and that impacting your chain? Is that like, do you have a plan for that, or is that possible?
There's really three questions here, but I'll start with the first one. Like you mentioned, sort of like the AppChain thesis, perhaps not being very, very correct. I think it's not the AppChain thesis that's the problem. I think it's the understanding that AppChain here means a Cosmos SDK monolithic blockchain, right? Like technically, rollups can be seen as AppChains, basically, if they're dedicated to one purpose. So really what we're sort of like realizing now is that there's a whole spectrum of solutions from the most monolithic to the most modular, and depending on which pieces you slot in which parts, you'll get different results, basically. Now, in terms of the trade-offs of replicated security, I guess on the one hand, you get very high security and sort of like you get to become sort of an integral part of the Cosmos Hub's narrative, essentially, and community, and that's something that can be tremendously powerful. On the other side, though, you essentially put yourself in a situation where your project has to always compromise with the Cosmos Hub, because now the fates are sort of like tied. That potentially reduces sort of like the ability to make arbitrary decisions for the project. But I guess in an industry that focuses on decentralization, that's kind of a given anyway. So I don't see that as a major problem. It does have some sort of kind of like very scary scenarios where technically, just like any Cosmos SDK app chain, if 34% of the validators of the voting power decide to basically stop running your chain for some reason, they can, and your chain will halt. That's the case, except rather than these validators being sort of like very directly incentivized to run your chain because they got a lot of stake and everything here, that incentives alignment of the validators is less direct because they're really Cosmos Hub validators that are also running your chain at the same time, right? So that scenario sort of like becomes more possible, but at the same time, even from the Hub's perspective, it's actually sort of like a very bad scenario because it would break the credibility of the Hub as a provider of security. Yeah. So essentially, what like the trade-off here that I'm trying to point towards is that it moves a lot of these things towards sort of like the political realm, right? And I think that's something that's very sort of like Cosmos specific, right? Where like Cosmos has been building a lot of like political blockchain technologies essentially, and I think replicated security is sort of like part of that trend.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I like the point where if somehow replicated security in some sense failed Neutron, it would lose sort of its credibility for other blockchains. That's a very interesting point. Let's move to Dimension, Barry. So if I go and build on top of Dimension as opposed to having my chain with my own validator set, what are the trade-offs that I'm making here? We already talked about what I'm getting in terms of a package. So what do I have to give up?
So in essence, your community is saying, hey, like this chain, this other chain is going to be our validator. But that community is pretty much sovereign in the sense that that community could also fork into its own app chain. What is Neutron? Neutron is a consumer chain, but Neutron is also could be like its own chain. So for any rollup can become its own sovereign chain if it decides to. It's kind of like the social distinction that blockchains are really automating social consensus. So if the community decides that the rollup wants to be its own chain, and it's pretty easy to implement because it's already ABCI on the like technical implementation side, but socially a rollup can become its own chain, but it's delegating its own consensus from the get-go and saying, hey, we're trusting this other chain's validators, we're trusting like this one-event assumption that someone can submit a fraud proof. And so there's this trade-off saying like, hey, right now we're delegating our consensus, our trust to the Dimension chain, but we can also choose to become our own community. So this like optimism.
So there's an exit path in some sense. If there was a dispute or something, you're saying there's a way for the community that's using Dimension to then like move out or change their.
It would be more socially,
right?
That we become our own chain. So like this kind of social value moves from this liquidity pool and to another liquidity pool. Like you're reconstructing of like what this sovereign community is. Mm-hmm. So it becomes from a delegate consensus to its own consensus, and that's quite possible.
Do you see the exit path for rollups on Dimension as being sort of like more achievable than for rollups on the Ethereum ecosystem today, or less so? And do you see this as a good thing or a bad thing?
I think it's the same pretty much. The bridging protocols kind of ossify. Yeah, it's the same. Like Optimism can become its own L1 tomorrow. Which is the same thing for a rollup on Dimension to become its own L1. At the end of the day, if Optimism chose to become its own L1, this is like a social consensus. The Optimism now is not dependent on the like state transition function on the L1.
But with like IBC, all the existing value that had then spread around would be lost, right? You'd be essentially starting a new chain.
Exactly. So now you're depending on like social value changing, like social people saying, okay, now this is the actual chain, so moving that or like substituting like a like client or something.
Yeah. Do you see there being a difference between like sort of like Cosmos rollups, like what you guys are building, and Ethereum, in that like currently in Ethereum we see like a lot of sort of like mono rollups, right? Like ecosystems of their own, and so as an application developer, you go in and you deploy as part of there, but you're not building a rollup that has its own social consensus. It's part of this bigger ecosystem, right? So if you chose the wrong rollup and the rollup you got doesn't get adoption at the end of the day, or if you want to migrate, you don't actually have sort of like those equivalents that allow you to actually move easily. Whereas, let's say I launch my application as a rollup on Dimension, I can become a Cosmos SDK chain, or I can become a rollup on Celestia, or even one on Ethereum fairly easily, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's blockchains automate social consensus. So like if we get to like this part of the talk, really it's like every blockchain, every modular blockchain does have its own sovereignty if it decides to have so. But there are external dependencies like IBC channels, IBC connections, liquidity pools that are established, but that's the same thing for our Optimism as well.
Yeah, I think the main point is like, what is the cost? Like everything can be sovereign.
Yeah.
But what is the, like, is the cost high or is it low?
Yeah, so social consensus comes at a great cost in terms of the coordination, but this is more so like a coordination cost rather than the economic cost.
So I think this is great. I don't have to do anything here. That's pretty awesome. I don't know if you guys noticed, I haven't said anything for a while. It's like, guys, doing my job. I was going to ask about lock-in. I think you guys covered that pretty well. But let's sort of move to Celestia and center the discussion on you guys now, Callum. What assumptions am I making, or what sort of dependencies am I introducing when I'm using, just the bottom of the stack? I guess you guys are, in some sense, the most open or the most modular of these options. I don't know if you guys agree. Yeah. But then, of course, the developer has to do a lot more to, create a functioning chain. But by launching on, your DA stack, what are the assumptions? What are the security assumptions I'm making? What am I giving up in terms of my ability to?
Yeah, I guess we wouldn't say like a DA stack. We're not implying that you use, in fact, there could be different stacks, and Dimension is a stack on top of Celestia, the same way that you might want to use Sovereign Labs if you want more ZK relevant things, or Rollkit, of course, is the sort of in-house thing. So yeah, we're just focusing on that in terms of like, what is your dependency? Of course, there is a security dependency on the Celestia network.
For a rollup.
For a rollup, yes.
Not for Dimension. Dimension is like a tendermint chain. So
Yeah, but
the
if you're-
rollup is dependent on like the
But
security.
if you're
section.
posting, if the rollup is posting its data to Celestia as part of its data availability thing, then it is also reliant on
Yeah, the
Celestia.
rollup.
Yeah, the rollup.
The rollup.
Yeah.
Yeah, talking about the security, John in his like complete guide to rollup, right? Sort of like took the thesis that DA is one of the resources that we actually know how to scale very, very well. And since that's kind of like the core product of Celestia, do you think, like how do you see this sort of like working with the valuation of the chain, which still is sort of like where it gets its economic security as Celestia itself being a proof of stake chain? Do you see this as potentially being a problem in the distant future, or
Like you're talking about its ability to scale. As being like
the ability to remain like economically secure at scale, given the fact that DA is not the resource that's like the most highly priced?
Yeah. So the pricing of the security of that.
Yes.
Like, and this is the thing as well. So now we're in this space with multiple security models. You can kind of hybrid combine this. And this is something that like Celestia is looking into as well. We don't just require consensus. We can also like use a fraud-proof model. So every single transition in Celestia itself can have fraud proofs. And so that everyone can sort of detect when there actually has been security about this. So about the issue about the sort of stake not being large enough, you've also got that. I do think because of the sort of use of tier as the denomination that you pay for the bytes that there will be sort of value with that, and people will sort of like want to use tier for other things as well. Like I think there is the sort of topic around token issuance as a roll-up, which is something for another day. But I think there could be some interesting situations where a lot of roll-ups rely on tier in a heavy way.
I definitely agree. I think this is like one of the main value props for rollups, especially just deploying on Celestia, is that you have this one token model that you could just cut off from the top like Arbitrum and Optimism.
Yeah.
So that, I guess, makes it easier for builders. They don't have to worry about issuing their own token and paying for their security. They can just use a token that's already available on the platform and just focus on the business, make sure their app works, it's actually useful, instead of worrying about all this issuance and stuff like that.
Yeah, like I think we talk about like the interchange security with the sort of the dependencies you have, and what about the alignment? What happens if your community becomes misaligned with that of the? But I think there is also another issue about like what is the cost of security? You talked about how many billions that there is there. So there's 175. I think it was 175 now?
validators, yeah.
Yeah, 175 validators who are all running their machines. That's really costly just to study your community. And I don't know, maybe you've got an existing community, so it's already quite large, but say you're just starting with one, because every single idea actually starts out centralized. It comes from like one, and then they share with another, and they get more sort of validity, and then it becomes decentralized. So I think it's actually very natural in the way that these like ideas grow, that it starts quite centralized, and then if it has any validity to it, then it starts to take off. And that kind of reflects the like structure of a roll-up. You can start off very centralized. It's just you. You're trusting yourself. And then as other people start to like trust you, you could then start to make the community more decentralized. You can move into like fraud proofs, ZK proofs. If it gets bigger, you can start using consensus engines. You can start using mesh security, all that sort of stuff. So like security you start sort of paying for, the more buy-in you get from people. You don't start paying millions of dollars in security when you've got like one user.
Isn't though one of the major like selling points of like decentralized sequencers the fact that you can start with a very decentralized sort of like sequencers like from the get-go, and like use that to actually launch your rollup like way faster than you would if you had to rebuild the entire thing?
Yes, like you just, and then there's going to be like a lot of these development kits, these SDKs being built out. So I think it's going to be very quick. I think the idea is to be as quick as like deploying a smart contract, right? That's where we're kind of competing with. And the previous competition of having a Tendermint Cosmos SDK IBC thing all the way up and trying to find your validators, is maybe not just getting the developers that we sort of hoped for. So can we somehow fix that? Let's look at like roll-ups as an alternative.
Right. We already touched on this idea, I know, several times, but I still want to like give it a topic of its own, which is sort of exit paths and transit paths, right? So, for example, under what conditions and in how would you guys go about, for example, moving from ICS to like building your own sovereign chain if that time came around? Are there some conditions? Are you
as Barry said, it's all social consensus at this point, right? So it's like, why would the like community of people who control the chain at that point want to do that, like there would need to be a good reason why making that change, despite the coordination cost, the technical, like the risk that that sort of migration would take, right? So like I think it's very unlikely unless there is some like adversarial relationship between like the provider of security and then the consumer chain within replicated security, right? Or if the provider like dies, for example, which could happen, right? But like, so in that sort of like critical scenario where there's a reason that's strong enough to justify that thing, basically what you would do is just fork the chain. You would try and keep all of the existing state, and you would just change the part of it that are specific to replicated security, and you'd relaunch that basically. But the problem becomes sort of like all of the elements around the chain that sort of like have a view on what that chain is. So like all of the IBC paths, like potential like centralized issuers that, you know, you need to build consensus within these entities as well, that the new chain is sort of like the canonical version of the chain, right?
Yeah.
So.
Right. So what I'm trying to get at is that's not on your radar. Like you're sort of 99.9% assuming this is all going to work out, and like you're going to remain a consumer chain, and it's going to scale with you as far as it goes.
That's the current plan, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say that, and that's a great point, because like sovereignty in a multi-chain world is very interdependent. I don't know what sovereignty really is, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you get those tighter links, you know, more interchain communication. Like, yeah, that's I would agree with that view. So. We already discussed with you, I guess, you know, it would be possible for a rollup to move out as long as they remained, you know, on Celestia on the bottom DA layer. Like they could move out and sort of like build their rollup, change the stack of their rollup to directly talk to Celestia. But what if I wanted to get, you know, like stop using the Celestia DA layer? Is that something like that even possible? I don't know. Like I'm just asking.
If you've got enough development, then you can go back to just being a normal Cosmos chain, right? You build out, it becomes from like a centralized sequencer, a decentralized sequencer, more people are being involved. All right, let's make it a proof of stake system. I don't know, like you can, I guess you can go that path if you want to, because remember, like consensus in the Cosmos environment is consensus both on block production and like state transitions. So at the moment, you're responsible for the security of state transitions, and Celestia is responsible for the security of block production, but you can take over that if you want to, if it gets big enough.
So would that be like a fork? It's hard for me to imagine that in my mind, how that would work.
No, because you're in control of your state. You're actually the redundancy around DA is like super simple. Like if for example, like the main threat with Celestia is that we censor your transactions. We don't allow you to publish things, right? And in that can or the like worst is that we equivocate and we publish two different blocks, and then people sort of fall in that. But I won't get into that. The worst is we sort of censor you, in which case you can recognize that and then move to another DA layer. And I'm pretty sure the like API layers between each of these DAs are going to be very similar. It's just posting random bytes. So that's the fact that it's so easy to switch means even that the sort of like the validators on Celestia are going to want to be honest. They know that if they're not giving a good service because they're an infrastructure chain, that people aren't going to like come to them, right. And you know the price.
So it's the same problem with loss of credibility, just in case.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like that's the thing with modularism. Basically, as soon as you're expecting a project to basically rely on you for a critical part of their protocol, like you need to build that sort of like service level agreement essentially. Otherwise, like there will be competition and they will overtake you because they will be seen as more reliable. I realize I should kind of mention one thing about like the migration out of ICS. Like we haven't seen this happen ever, and it probably will be a while before that actually happens in the wild, if it ever does. But we're seeing sort of like the reverse being at least worked on currently with Stride, which is a liquid staking Cosmos SDK app chain. You know, having passed a signaling proposal to join replicated security. And so that chain already has IBC connections. It has assets in liquidity pool on other chains.
That's right.
And it is in the process of sort of like moving to replicated security. And so migrating this whole thing and, you know, building consensus around that thing is, you know, it's difficult, but they're in the process of doing it. And so I think like that's going to be a really interesting like sort of like moment to watch essentially in that regard.
I think ICS, one of the main selling points is that you can transition out, like, and become your own sovereign chain. And I think that's why even Dimension considered it.
But I think after you all do all this work and get in, you won't want to do the work of getting back out there. If
well, it really depends.
I'm just
actually.
I was being more, you know, more of a joke. But so it'll be absolutely interesting to watch how they manage all of this. That's absolutely right. So they already have, in some sense, locking in this sovereign chain type of situation, and now they're going to move to replicated security, and they have to go, you know, take all that stuff with them. Yeah.
Yeah, I
There
mean,
are other
like,
security products as well. Like if you have like the mesh security stuff as well, and I think actually like interchain security is, it's just that V1 and it's a little bit like rigid, and I think you're gonna see it getting a lot more like dynamic, and it's gonna be like, hey, I am a community member of X, but I also associate Y with Y and Z, and I'm gonna have security from all of these
More
things.
choice, right.
And yeah.
In the
there is-
spirit of this
yeah.
sort of, redundancy thesis, Barry, are you guys thinking of providing alternatives to the Celestia DA layer? Is that in your roadmap? Like you'd like to have more choices for your rollups?
Like different DAs?
Yeah.
Yeah, you could use, eventually we want to use other Cosmos L1s as DAs, but they won't be as efficient as the, Celestia because of DA sampling. So it really becomes like a cost competition between the DAs,
Right.
or the
Yeah.
L1s, and then like eventually in an open fee market, Celestia should win with the.
Yeah, I think you did put out a tweet about like people being able to use the Cosmos Hub as DA, right?
If
like,
they have a data module, if they have like.
okay, they would need to have a
yeah.
dedicated solution. Yeah,
You
okay.
can use Bitcoin if you want.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean,
Yeah.
right.
So there's efficiency
Gain
and not
Bitcoin.
efficiency.
Right.
And these costs go up to the rollup and the rollup users.
Right.
So it's really up to the rollup community, and you would assume that they're using the most efficient DA.
Right. But in case of ever censorship transaction or something, transaction censorship happening, they could switch over and move around. So they'd still be this choice. So I think that's good news for the future of the Cosmos ecosystem. I think there's, it's going to be bewildering for a while. All these choices, all these options, all these ideas until things settle down. But right now, I think we're in a technically good place. There's a lot of exploration going on. So I think we're really good to close the panel. So thank you very much, guys.
Thank
It
you.
was great talking to you. And
Likewise.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you.